It has been a historic and traumatic week in Washington, D.C. President Trump encouraged a violent mob to storm the U.S. Capitol, piercing the very heart of our democracy, after falsely claiming he won the 2020 election. There are just 12 days left in President Trump's term, but amid them, there are growing calls for him to resign or to be removed. House Democrats are drafting articles of impeachment again. And some on President Trump's cabinet are talking about invoking the 25th Amendment to force him out. My sources tell me it is very unlikely that Vice President Pence would agree to do that. Those close to President Trump say he is embarrassed and isolated. On Thursday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi didn't hold back.
The President has committed an unspeakable assault on our nation and our people. I join the Senate Democratic leader in calling on the Vice President to remove this president by immediately invoking the 25th Amendment. If the Vice President and the Cabinet do not act, the Congress may be prepared to move forward with impeachment.
Joining us tonight are the best reporters covering Congress and the White House: Nancy Cordes, chief congressional correspondent for CBS News; Astead Herndon, national political reporter for the New York Times; and Jake Sherman, founder of the new Punchbowl News. Jake, today a draft of the articles of impeachment have been circulating. The question on everyone's mind: could President Trump be removed from office in the final weeks of his term?
It doesn't seem likely, Mish. Thanks for having me. It doesn't seem likely. There are only a couple days left here. But the House is undoubtedly, in the next couple of days, going to move toward an impeachment vote, potentially next week, most likely next week. The 25th Amendment is really not a live option for removing the president. There's a lot of hurdles between invoking the 25th Amendment and getting the president out of office. But so the House will pass impeachment. Then it goes over to the currently the Republican Senate. You would need a lot of Republicans to agree to remove the president. I will say this, though. In my time covering Congress and Donald Trump's presidency, this is the most angry that Republicans have been with Donald Trump, the most disappointed, the most disgusted, pick your word here. They are very, very through with Donald Trump at the moment. They believe that he incited this violence. He sent his protesters to the Capitol. We don't have to guess that. He told his protesters at a rally, we're going to march up to the Capitol. So they did. I was in the Capitol. They were loud. They were inappropriate. They were violent. People died. So I just think that what Republicans are going to say is, listen, there's 10, 5, however many days when this starts left of Donald Trump's presidency, and we should spare him and let him finish out his days and move on to Joe Biden on January 20th.
Jake just indicated that it's going to be super hard to get President Trump, it seems, out of office with just 12 days left in office. Nancy, what is the calculation here when it comes to all the things that we're seeing, especially, of course, as these articles of impeachment have been circulating?
Well, I interviewed David Cicilline today. He's one of the authors of these articles of impeachment, and I asked him, essentially, why do this now when the president is about to leave anyway? And what he said was, first of all, they need to send a message to this president and to future presidents and to other countries and to future generations that there are some things that Congress just will not accept. And the fact that this president is about to head out the door, no matter what happens, isn't a reason not to send that message. As far as Republicans are concerned, not all of them, but some of them, there is a silver lining here. And that is that if the Senate does vote to convict this president even after he has left office, and that is a possibility, they could take this up even after he's gone, if they're successful in mustering 2/3 of the Senate to vote to convict him, he cannot run for president again. And for many Republicans, the notion of not having this president and the specter of another Trump run for office 4 years from now is pretty appealing, pretty motivating.
Astead, Nancy's saying it's pretty appealing to Republicans to have Trump be out of the way. You've been covering the Senate race in Georgia. What has losing the control of the Senate done to Republicans, especially when it comes to the political calculations ahead?
Well, I think that there was a political message, and then there's the kind of more policy concerns going forward. The political message certainly is that the Republicans in that race made a bet with Trump that failed. And that is a warning sign for a Republican Party that cannot put together this Trump coalition without him at the top of the ballot. More importantly, you had the Democratic motivated base that really overwhelmed that. And I think that for those Republican senators, the mess that Trump caused in that race, the split between the governor and the senators, the Secretary of State, the infighting among kind of more traditional suburban Republicans and that core MAGA base was not one that was worth it. And so I think that that one just crystallizes the political problems Republicans have going forward. But then obviously it expands the possibilities for Joe Biden going ahead. Cabinet positions and policy are just expanded by the idea that he will now be able to get a tie-breaking vote with Vice President Kamala Harris through the Senate. So there are those policy concerns, but I really think it's a political rebuke just as big as we saw in November with Biden's victory.
We now have Phil Rucker, White House bureau chief for the Washington Post. Thanks so much for being here, Phil. Astead was just talking about the calculations and, of course, the Republicans losing control of the Senate. I want to talk to you about what's going on inside this White House. Georgia is seen as a rebuke, but there's also, of course, all these resignations. Twitter suspending the president permanently today. What are you hearing about what's going on in the White House? I'm hearing that there's chaos, that tensions are as high as they've ever been.
Yeah, I'm hearing the exact same, Yamiche. Our sources are telling us that the president feels under siege, and he is in an alarmingly fragile emotional and psychological state right now. He spent most of Wednesday fuming about Vice President Pence, angry with his loyal number two, not responsive to the needs of the Capitol. He was not engaged in the decision to deploy the military, the National Guard up there to help quell the unrest. He resisted pleas from his advisors to tell his supporters to go home and to stand down. He resisted recording the video that he ultimately grudgingly agreed to do last night for the very first time, acknowledging his electoral fate, which is that he lost the election and that there's going to be a new president come January 20th. But this is a difficult time for the president. And the reality is there are very few advisors left around him. We've seen a number of resignations, and those who are the closest to him right now, Mark Meadows, the chief of staff, among others, are his biggest enablers. They're the people who are giving the president misinformation, who are helping him believe these fantasies that he's believed for the last 2 months about the election. And it has a lot of other people in the administration very concerned about how dangerous he might be as president in his final 12 days.
And Phil, you're saying it's a difficult moment for the president. It's also a difficult moment, of course, for the nation. Let's take a closer look at the breach on Capitol Hill Wednesday. The violence left 5 people dead. That, as a pandemic continues to kill thousands of Americans every day, President Trump now faces allegations that he incited a riot. In a speech an hour before violence broke out, he encouraged his supporters to march to the Capitol.
We won in a landslide. This was a landslide. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. We're going to walk down to the Capitol. You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
What President Trump said is not true. He did lose the election, and the vice president's role was only ceremonial. Jake, you were inside the Capitol as all this was happening. I saw your videos of the chaos as I was reporting from the White House. What did you see inside the building with protesters and with Capitol Police, who some say failed to do their jobs?
Well, you know, clearly it's a failure of a lot of people when a crowd, a mob, not a protest, a mob of people end up in the Capitol running free and roaming free throughout the otherwise or the previously secure hallways. I was sitting in the House Periodical Press Gallery, where I sit every day. Everyone here knows where that is, and I walked out to down the hallway, and I knew that people had gotten into the building, and people were smashing feet from me, smashing their way through this glass door. We've now seen the images all over. A police officer fell, and they were, next thing I knew, we were hunkered down in an office for 3 hours. People were banging on our doors. People were armed. There was a SWAT team going throughout the hallway. We weren't actually evacuated, Yamiche. It's fascinating. For several hours, we were like sitting ducks, a bunch of reporters. We kept saying to ourselves, what should we do? And I kept saying, nothing. We're not armed. We have no way of defending ourselves against large crowds of people. So, I mean, it was an alarming episode, to say the least. And the scary thing is we always talked about in the Capitol whether, if people got in, would police ever be able to get them out? It's such a large and sprawling building, seven buildings put together. It's a large complex. Thankfully, with the help of the FBI, ATF, Capitol Police, Secret Service, DC Police, they were able to clear the place out and secure it once again. But really, an episode that I'll never forget.
We will never forget this episode, and what you're describing just gave me goosebumps because it's so scary. Nancy, you've been in that building, that Capitol building, so many times. It's one of the most secure buildings in the world. When I go through there, I have to get checked. All my stuff gets scanned. How did this mob get in? How did this happen?
Well, in some ways, it may have simply been a failure of not just intelligence, but of imagination. You know, everyone here at the Capitol is used to huge protests. That's just sort of a fact of life here on Capitol Hill. But those are usually peaceful protests. People are willing to get arrested, almost asking to get arrested. They want to make their point peacefully. This was the absolute opposite. You had hundreds, if not thousands of people banging on those doors. They came with weapons, and they just simply overwhelmed the Capitol Police Force. And I think, when I talk about a failure of imagination, I just don't think anyone had ever conceived that something like this could happen because it had never happened before. When I started the day on Wednesday here at the Capitol, the last thing on my mind was the possibility that this huge crowd, and I saw this people gathering in the streets on my way to work before dawn. They were already out there by the hundreds. It never occurred to me that they might en masse storm the Capitol. And clearly, law enforcement officials hadn't considered that either. But we're now in a really unusual situation, Yamiche, where the House Sergeant at Arms, the Senate Sergeant at Arms, and the Capitol Police Chief have all stepped down a week and a half before the inauguration. So you've got all the power at the top here on Capitol Hill among law enforcement gone before one of our biggest high security events, the inauguration of the next president, at a time when there are great concerns that these individuals could try to strike again. So yes, tonight the Capitol is secure, but I can tell you a lot of lawmakers, a lot of aides still feel very nervous because they're worried that that something like this could happen again, and they themselves are still being hounded at the airport, on airplanes, wherever they go. Lindsey Graham had to have a full complement of law enforcement around him at the airport today because people were screaming at him. This is not going away.
Astead, you've been doing so much reporting when it comes to right-wing extremism. Did you see this coming? What has your reporting told you about whether or not a moment like this could happen?
Yeah, in some ways, I think for some of us who have been not in Washington, but across the country over the last 3, 4 years, not only at Trump rallies, but at kind of smaller events organized online, you've seen this violence, you've seen this type of mob activity before. It has been a feature of the Trump presidency and the Trump era. It's been, frankly, though, out of the mainstream case. This is kind of communities that have organized locally and have been really motivated by the really potent mix of conspiracy and bigotry, a kind of a mess of misinformation, but also one that does not kind of believe in the real tenets of multiracial democracy and does not respect those folks' right to really have their say on this government. I remember being in Northwest Arizona last year at an event called Trump Stock, and a man put his gun on the table and said, if Donald Trump loses, we'll have another civil war. That's the type of language you've heard at these type of things for a while. What happened yesterday was a culmination of those events that came to Washington, to the seat of democracy, to the kind of hollow places where we don't think this is possible. But it has been growing and fermenting around the country for years.